So, a few different announcements. Number one, as some people who are not here discovering, the online delivery system that we usually use is not working. They didn't put the link in there properly for me to be able to record it. So the people that are online right now are looking at it, and there's a link that says office hours. And how some of you may know, I do online office hours on which day? Monday.
Monday, Wednesday.
You got it? You got 5 chances. No?
Friday.
Yes. Friday. She's like, bonus point? Friday. I do online office hours using the same system that we use every time in class. And so I'm online. So if you have questions, you can log on like they do, and we can go over things, etc. That's from 10 to 11. In addition to my other regular office hours. So because our regular system isn't working, though, we had this one happen one other time. Because it's not working, what I'm actually do is I'm recording this using another Illuminate system that I have for my class in California. Okay? So I'm still recording it, which means that what I'll do is I will post on Canvas a link to this recording once we're done today. For you guys that are here, doesn't matter too much because you're getting it now, but if you want to look at it and review it, or hear it a second time or something like that, I'll post the link. And for those that are online, they're going to have to get this lecture online instead. Okay? So those people can be studying right now for this hour and a half, and then they can do their lecture after. It's just the reverse of what you guys are doing. You're doing the lecture now, you do study later. They do the reverse. It's all the same. So the other question that we had, though, was talking about the other archives that we have made previously. So the other archives that we have made previously, this is a typical page here. So it's illuminate.mesacc.edu. That's where you go. This link is in the very first module where it says like study materials and things like that. Okay? So if you go to illuminate.mesacc.edu, you will get this page here where it lists all the different activities, online activities for the day. Okay? Now right there you can see it says MC Cheroske Bio 60 office hours. This is not my day for office hours. This is my day for the lecture. So that should be a live link that you would click on to log in to view it live online. If you want to view a recording, though, a past archive, let's say you want to listen to the cardiovascular lecture that happened 2 Thursdays ago, okay? It's a 2-step process. Number one, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, it says meetings, where we are now. You click on recordings instead, because you're not looking for live stuff, you're looking for a recording. You're looking for the archive. So we click on recording. Then you go to the date of the recording that you want to view. So if it was like 2 weeks ago on a Thursday, well, November 1st was last Thursday. Click back to October. So maybe October 25th was the Thursday before. And there we go, right there. We can see an active link for that 160 lecture from that day. You just click on that, it'll open up a separate window, and it will show you the same thing. Show you the big PowerPoint slide, it'll show you the, if we have video feed going in, it'll show you the video feed and stuff like that. You hear the audio coming out of it, it's all right there. Okay? So anything that you want to review, look at the syllabus, look on what we were doing on that day, then go to recordings, go to that particular date, and you should see the link to the archive right there in the middle. You can do that for most any day that we've done all throughout this. Okay, so those people that are online, we're going to need to do that. Okay, so what we're going to do today is respiratory system. Last time we went over immune system, and last time we did a fairly decent job, I think, going over immune system and really focusing on the major important topics and saying, you need to know this. Forget this detail now. You need to know these major topics here. Okay? That's what we're going to do today for respiratory system. We're going to make it slim and trim. We're going to look through it and say, what are the major things that we need to know in preparing for the exams coming on Thursday. Okay? Okay. Now, luckily, the respiratory system is pretty straightforward in terms of its particular parts and their particular function. Unlike some of our other systems like cardiovascular system where it's like all over the place and there's lots of different organs and it goes all over the place, with respiratory system, it's very concise. Okay? Only within the thoracic cavity, and there's some upper respiratory things here like the mouth and the nose, etc. So it's pretty simplified that way. Now, the lab for respiratory system isn't until this weekend. Do you guys see the announcement about that? There's an announcement or an email, right? So I posted an announcement, must have been. I could say it was an email, maybe Dad can get it. But I put it out there that respiratory system lab isn't until this weekend. So if you want to do the respiratory system lab stuff, it's obviously going to help you in terms of learning respiratory system because they overlap. But the lab quiz itself is not due till the end of this weekend. So don't worry about doing the lab stuff unless you want to as a study exercise. Okay? Sometimes the lecture and the lab are not exactly in sync with one another. Like immune system, we didn't have anything at all. Okay? So respiratory system is this week in both lecture and lab. It's just the lab quiz isn't until this weekend. All right? But what we're going to start out with when we're going through respiratory system is looking at number one, what's it there for? Number two, we look at macroscopic. What are all the different anatomical parts that are a part of the respiratory system? And then number three, we tend to get down to how the system works. And we may need to look down to cellular level to see how that works. But we want to talk about how the system does its job, how it contributes to homeostasis and things like that. So, when we were talking about cells way back when, we talked about the fact that they need oxygen in order to produce ATP through aerobic respiration. At the end of that process, they produce as a byproduct carbon dioxide. So they are getting rid of this waste product, and we need it out of the body. At the same time, they need more oxygen in order to undergo their chemical reactions. So the respiratory system works closely with the cardiovascular system to make sure that the cells have what they need in terms of respiratory gases, to make sure we're delivering oxygen to them as they need it, and we're getting rid of that carbon dioxide from them. Okay? Now, these five things here are the important components of the respiratory system. These five things make the respiratory system able to do its job. Okay? The first thing is what's called ventilation. Okay? So ventilation is just the act of moving air into and out of the lungs. Okay? So if you can get the air to go into and out of the lungs, that's what most people think about in terms of the respiratory system, right? See the lungs getting bigger and getting smaller, and okay, the respiratory system's working. But, right, if that was it, then, well, how do the cells in the bottom of my foot survive? If all the gas exchange and stuff's going on here, and it's just air lungs here, how are my cells way down there benefiting from that? Okay? So it's definitely important that we can get air to come from the surrounding environment and go into the lungs, and that when we exhale, we can push air out of the lungs. That's only the first step in the process. The second step of the process is gas exchange, right? The blood is in the cardiovascular system is the system that distributes things to and from the cells. It's how we're going to get oxygen to the cells in the bottom of my foot. It's how we're going to get carbon dioxide from those cells up to my lungs so that I can haul, exhale, and get rid of it. Okay? But in order for us to get it into and out of the blood, we have to have what's called gas exchange. Now, when we were talking about cardiovascular system, we said that we have these very, very small blood vessels that allow exchange to occur. Right? Things go out, things come in. Right? What are those? Thinnest and smallest ones. Capillaries. Exactly, right? So capillaries. So what we're going to find is, in the lungs, there's all these different capillaries that are surrounding the lung tissue that are going to be able to pick up the oxygen from the inflated lungs and dump in carbon dioxide so that when we exhale, we can get rid of that carbon dioxide. So gas exchange is important. So we inflate the lungs, but we've got to be able to exchange this oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's the second important step. It's no good if you just inflate the lungs like a balloon, and if that gas doesn't exchange, then the cells in my foot aren't going to get anything. All that air is going to be in the lungs, and my cells can't get to it. We've got to get it into and out of the blood. So then, third step, blood is going to transport it around. And then, once the oxygen is in the blood and it comes out to the bottom of my foot, we've got to make sure that, again, it's going to be able to exchange with the tissues down there, right? So we've got to be able to drop off the oxygen. It doesn't do you any good if I have oxygen here, and I say, look, I have oxygen, you can't have any, right? So we've got to be able to drop the oxygen off with the cells and pick up their waste product. Just like the Postal Service, right? You got to do both of those jobs, delivery and pickup. So gas exchange out at the tissues is also going to be important because those cells that are working, that last step down there, when the cells are working, they need that oxygen and they need that carbon dioxide to get rid of it. So what we have then are, up here, we have something that is going to be called, this is going to be external respiration. It's gas exchange with the external environment, okay? That's what this is. This, down here, is going to be called internal respiration. Gas exchange with the body cells and tissues, okay?
So not until it gets into the cells and tissues, it's internal?
Right. Right. Exchanging between the blood and the tissues is internal respiration, okay? So really we have 4 critical steps there. Ventilation, getting the air to move into and out of the lungs. External respiration, where we exchange gases with the blood in the lungs. Transport, which is really a cardiovascular function, not a respiratory function. And then internal respiration, where we drop off that oxygen and we pick up that carbon dioxide from the tissues. Okay? So all 4 of those things are important. If you don't have any, if you're missing one of those 4 components, then your respiratory system isn't doing its job. And your tissues are going to starve and die off. Okay? Okay, so that's the first thing. Knowing those 4 different processes there as part of the respiratory system is quite important. All right, so let's move on then. So the next thing we do, we talk about what the respiratory system is going to do. We need to look at the parts that are going to allow it to happen. Okay? So there's 2 main kind of branches of the respiratory system. There are the structures that contribute to the upper respiratory tract and the structures that contribute to the lower respiratory tract. So sometimes when you go to the doctor, they'll say you got an upper respiratory tract infection or something like that. You're like, I get it. Upper means somewhere up higher. But what does that mean? Where is it? Okay? Look at the structures involved here. Upper respiratory tract, nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, and pharynx. So this is the pharynx. The pharynx is the back of the throat. Okay? So the pharynx is the back of the throat. So you know that if you inhale air through your nose or through your mouth, it's going to go to the back of your throat. Okay? That's going to be part of upper respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract, the dividing line is going to be the larynx. The larynx is the fancy name for the voice box. So if you see your Adam's apple or whatever, at least more obvious when you're a guy, that's going to be the larynx. At the larynx, we're going to see a division between 1 tube, where both food and air go, to 2 tubes as we move inferiorly from that. So here we're still 1 tube. When we go below that, we separate into an air tube, which is called the trachea, and a food tube, which is behind it, which is called the esophagus. From there on, we have separate tubular systems. Food goes one way, air goes the other way. Upper respiratory tract is common, air and food. Lower respiratory tract, we're going to separate them, right? If you've ever tried to talk while you're eating and drinking, you know that trying to make the wrong substance go into the wrong tube is not a good thing, okay? So lower respiratory tract is going to be larynx, like the voice box, trachea, we always call it bronchial tree, and then the rest of the structures of the lungs, and we'll talk about what those are going to be. So here we see it right there, okay? So if we divide it right about like here, that's going to be our dividing line between upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. And the tree that we were talking about, it's like an inverted tree, okay? So here is the trunk. Then we have all these branches. You have the big branch and then the smaller branch and smaller branches, right? It looks like an inverted tree, a tree that's upside down like that. That's what we call the bronchial tree. So the air, these are big passageways. Now remember with the cardiovascular system, in a way it's kind of similar. There's a series of tubes, and we're moving stuff through the tubes. And some of the big tubes are just about getting, whatever that is, from point A to point B. No exchange, no nothing like that. Arteries about getting it away from the heart and taking it down to arterioles and capillaries. Okay? Once we get to the capillaries, then we're going to have very thin, very small structures that allow us to exchange across the wall. Okay? This is going to be similar. We've got big tubes like trachea and bronchi, etc., getting smaller and smaller and smaller. At some point, we can't see it here yet, At some point, we're going to get to a small enough structure that's going to allow exchange to occur. It's going to have a thin enough wall things can get across. And we're going to have lung structures that are nice and thin like that, and right next to them, we're going to have those capillaries ready to pick up the oxygen and deliver that carbon dioxide. Okay? Okay. So, here's where we're going to streamline a little bit. Okay? Most of the beginning of this here is going to be anatomy, talking about the different parts of the respiratory system and kind of what they do. Okay? There's more detail here than we really need to know at this point. So, what we'll do is paranasal sinuses, okay? Paranasal sinuses, like you see like right here, okay, are air-filled spaces within some of the bones of the skull. They connect to the nasal cavity, they have air that goes into them. That's about it. Okay? They're called paranasal sinuses because they're around the nasal cavity. Okay, but our main pathways for air is going to be like in the nose and in the nasal cavity here and in the mouth, so we can get to the pharynx. Now remember, the pharynx is going to be the back of the throat. Okay? So the pharynx is going to be all of this back here. That's the pharynx. And there's a nasopharynx up here from the nasal cavity, there's an oropharynx right here, and there's a laryngopharynx, which is down here. Okay? Once we get down here, then we're into that voice box which is called the larynx. Yeah?
So for the sinuses and the larynx, do we need to know specific ones or just generally where they're located?
For lab this weekend, we'll let that go for lab. What's this part was to do? What's that part was to do? And stuff like that. Lecture exam, we're more about what's the system, how does it do its job in terms of exchanging gases and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, there might be like a rare question on there where it says, you know, the trachea, is that part of the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract? But it's not going to get into a lot of detail in terms of anatomy. So this figure here just shows us some of larynx. This just closes a zoomed up view of what we already saw, larynx, trachea, and then the bronchial tree and stuff like that. Okay? It does give us a little bit of a shot, and you'll see a model like this weekend, of the very small microscopic structures that are at the end of these branches. Okay? This term right here, alveolus, these are the very small structures that are going to be associated with the capillaries where the gas exchange is going to occur. Okay? Now notice it's spelled alveolus or alveolus, A-L-V-E-O-L-U-S. I don't know, for whatever reason, a lot of people tend to forget that first L. And they go alveolus instead of alveolus. Okay? But those are going to be the sites of exchange of the respiratory gases down in the lungs. Okay? And we're going to see if those are working or not. So this is still just anatomy. Here, this whole thing here that looks like a bunch of grapes is called an alveolar sac. Okay? The individual grapes, if you will, are the things that we call alveoli. Alveoli is an I on the end that's plural, and alveolus is just we're talking about one individual one like this. Okay? But look, here is an alveolus right here. You see under the capillary bed totally surrounding it there? Right? That means we have all of these areas through here that we can exchange oxygen and trade it for carbon dioxide. Okay? So this is where that second critical step in the process is going to come into play. External respiration. It's going to be between these little bubbles that we call alveoli and the surrounding capillaries. So the capillaries are going to drop off their carbon dioxide. It's going to go into the alveolus. The air in the alveolus is going to drop off oxygen. It's going to go into the blood, and then the blood will take it around to the rest of the systems of the body. Yes?
So one single alveolus is surrounded by that much netting of capillaries?
Yeah. And usually, you know, it's a little bit, that's giving us something that's a little bit more detailed, but you definitely, if you look at it in a microscope, like this, okay, here's an alveolus right here. This is an individual alveolus. These are capillaries. There's one, you can see some red blood cells in it. Here's one here. Here's one here. And it all depends on the cut as to how many you see. But you can see there's at least a few capillaries that are wrapping it, giving us a lot of surface area to be able to exchange gases across here like this. Okay? There's a capillary, there's a capillary, there's a capillary. Any of these smaller circles that you see here are capillaries. It wouldn't really even have an angle, because you can see there's so many of these. You could cut across this way and look at that. You could cut across this way and look at that. You're seeing lots of different bubbles in cross-section. So it's like you took a, I don't know, I was trying to think of like a ball or balloon, but it seemed like cutting a ball or balloon, it pops. But you know what I mean? You see the periphery of it like that.
Like a honeycomb or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So the gases go through the alveolus.
Mm-hmm. Goes across the alveolar wall.
Alveolar wall, and then it goes through the capillaries.
Yeah.
The blood cells are inside the capillaries, and that's what the gases.
And they're going to pick it up.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we're going to remember, because when we talk about cardiovascular system, we said two things. We said that we have these cells that transport oxygen. What are those cells? Red blood cells, right? We have the hemoglobin molecules that are the primary way that we're transporting oxygen in the blood. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is not transported mainly in the cell. It's actually within the plasma as a molecule is called bicarbonate, HCO3. Okay? So bicarbonate ion is the main way that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood, and that's in the plasma. So you definitely need to know that. We say that one of those four steps is transporting the gases in the cardiovascular system. So how's that done? Oxygen is found in hemoglobin in the red blood cells. Carbon dioxide is in the plasma in the form of HCO3. That's bicarbonate ion. We'll see that towards the end of the chapter. You can see that in the notes. I'm just mentioning it here because we were talking about exchanging these gases. Okay? Okay. So, now we've gone through some of the anatomy, where we're looking at, okay, we saw some big structures, small structures. The question is, we have these four processes: ventilation, external respiration, transport of the blood, which we already learned about when we talked about the blood, and then internal respiration. Internal and external respiration are basically going to be the same. Whatever drives the movement of those gases with the lungs, with the alveoli in the blood, is going to be the same thing that happens down in the tissues. Okay? So that'll be one topic that we'll see a little bit later on. But we need to understand how each of those things occur. So the first one, ventilation, movement of air into and out of the lungs, we've got to figure out how that happens. How do we get air to go into the lungs? Okay? Okay. So there's two major things that we need to understand here. Let me see if I can give us a picture here. Okay? Alright, so here's a picture of the thoracic cavity, of the pleural cavities. Okay? And we can see along the sides here, we can see some muscles. Down here at the bottom, we've got this umbrella-shaped muscle that's called the diaphragm. Actually, the G is silent. It's called the diaphragm. But if you spell it correctly, it's got a G next to the end. Okay? The diaphragm is the main muscle that allows us to ventilate the lungs. Okay? Notice that when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's got this big umbrella shape to it, right? And when it contracts, it flattens out. Okay? Now, the diaphragm does most of the work. In addition to the diaphragm, the other major muscle that's responsible for helping us breathe or ventilate the lungs are going to be these muscles out here. See these red muscles out here between the ribs? Between the ribs, if we translated that into medical speak, it would be intercostal. Inter means between, costal or coastal means ribs. So the intercostals, these are called external intercostal muscles, and they were listed on the page before for the notes. The external intercostal muscles, when they contract, they spread the rib cage out to the sides. Okay? The external and internal intercostals, that meat right there, is what you eat when you go to Tony Roma's. Next time you're eating it, you gotta look at those fibers and you go, oh, these are muscles that help ventilate the lungs. Okay? Okay. So the diaphragm does most of it, but the external intercostals in between the ribs also help. Okay? So that's the first thing we need to know in terms of ventilating the lungs. The main muscles involved, the diaphragm and the external intercostals. Okay? Now the way that they do it is this. There is this relationship between what's called pressure and volume. Notice that these things are pointing out here, they all say pressure on them. Okay? Okay. So, when those muscles contract, look at what's going on in terms of where the lungs are located, right? When the diaphragm contracts, we go from space in the thoracic cavity or in the pleural cavity that's about that big, and now, when those muscles contract, now the amount of space or volume in that cavity is much bigger. Okay? So what we did is, using those muscles, we created a larger cavity here, a larger volume. And when we do that, what happens is that causes the pressure to go down. So let's think of this relation. This relationship between pressure and volume. It's called inverse, like this. When one of them goes up, the other one goes down. Okay? So think about this. On Thursday, when we do the exam, if we decide to do the exam in my office, and there's a handful of you that know where that is, okay? You'll notice that it's not as big as in here, okay? If we decide to do the exam in my office, there would be a lot of pressure in there for you guys to be able to have enough room to take your exam. Because we'd be taking all you guys here and all those people that aren't listening right now online, and we'd be jamming them into this space. We'd have the same number of themes, but we'd have a much smaller space. So we would jack the pressure way up, right? You'd be trying to find desk space, elbow space, and stuff like that. That'd be a lot of pressure, right? If we take the same number of students, and instead of doing it in that small volume, we allow you to have this space here, okay? Then, same number of things, bigger volume, the pressure now goes down. You've got some elbow room to be able to stretch out, right? These guys over here are probably going to lay on the table by themselves and stuff like that. They got all kinds of room, okay? So that's the relationship there. If we change the volume, then we change the pressure, okay? By contracting the diaphragm and this external intercostals, what we did is we increased the volume here. So we saw volume went up. We said inversely related to pressure. So if volume goes up, what happens to pressure? Pressure goes down. We give you lots of space, pressure goes down, okay? So what we did is we just decreased the pressure here in the lungs, inside of the lungs. That pressure inside of the lungs has this title here, intra-alveolar pressure. Okay? The alveolar part comes from the name of those little bubbles that make up the lungs. The lungs are spongy tissues made up of those bubbles. Okay? Intra, instead of intra means within. So this is the pressure inside of the lungs. Okay? So what we did is we created more volume inside of the cavity of the lungs, and it basically allows the lungs to be able to expand. Okay? And as the volume of the lungs expands, the pressure goes down. So what happens here, that's what we see here, right? When we weren't contracting those muscles, the pressure inside the lungs was like 760 millimeters of mercury. Don't worry about the actual number. But just see, it's like 760 there. When we contract the diaphragm and stuff like that, it goes down to like 758. Not a lot, but you can see that it goes down. All right. So now we know what's going on in the lungs. We just decreased the pressure in the lungs. See that other pressure on the right there? It says atmospheric pressure. Now when you hear the weather report or something like that, they talk about atmospheric pressure, right? They talk about, whoa, we got a high pressure system coming in here, a low pressure system this weekend, which is going to drop the temperature down to the floor. See that? So it's like it's going to be like 90 degrees on Thursday, and then like 80 degrees on Friday, and it's going to be like 70 degrees or lower on Saturday and Sunday. It's going to be like winter. Anyway, right? That, in essence, has to do with atmospheric pressure. You have one atmosphere of air sitting on top of you. That's some pressure. We know when we talk about chemistry, right? Molecules and things that are made up of matter have mass. Okay? So you have one atmosphere of pressure out here. Atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury, if you want to throw a unit on it. Okay? So what we have there is when we make this volume bigger, now the pressure has dropped in here, down to 758. So it's 758 in here, and 760 here. Okay? What we see is there's a difference there. It's high pressure here compared to here. Remember way back when we were talking about diffusion and stuff like that? We said we have a lot of things over here, like a high concentration here, and low over here. Things will naturally move from high to low. That's what we see right there. Okay? We've contracted our diaphragm and our external intercostals. We made this lower than it is here. So the air is going to move from high pressure here to low pressure in here. Okay? So that's important because what we're doing there is we are changing the volume of the cavity, which changes the pressure, and once the pressure gets down low enough, now there's a gradient to move from high to low, and the air will enter the lungs. Okay? So there's A couple key aspects about that. You need to know the muscles involved, diaphragm and external intercostal. Okay? When you contract that, it makes this volume bigger. That gives us what's called inhalation or inspiration. Same thing. Okay? Now, the second key part about that is knowing these two pressures that we see here. Okay? The pressure in the lungs is called intra-alveolar pressure, and the pressure outside in the atmosphere is called atmospheric pressure. Okay? So, whichever one of those is higher, the air is going to move from that area, and it's going to move to the area where the pressure is lower. During inspiration like this, it's going to go from the atmosphere, it's going to go into the lungs, and we're going to get inhalation. All right, so now the question is, we know how we breathe in, now we're sitting there holding our breath. That's only half the process, right? We have to haul, let it out again. So how do we let it out again? We're just going to do the opposite. Those muscles that we contracted and we moved out of the way like this, you're just going to relax them. Ribs are going to come down, diaphragm is going to come up again. It's going to create a smaller space here for the lungs to exist. As we shrink that space, pressure is going to go up. Okay? Once that intra-alveolar pressure reaches something like 762 millimeters like that, oh, now in that case, if we have 762 here and only 760 out here, now the air is going to move out. It's going to go from high pressure inside the lung to low pressure outside. Okay? All right. So, you can see whatever. We had other things there. So like we said, this is ventilation of lungs. We said there's 4 different processes that you need to know. Ventilation, external respiration, transport of gases, and then internal respiration, okay? That's ventilation, okay? You need to know the muscles involved, and you need to know those two pressures and how they work together. When you use the muscles to change the volume, that changes the pressure. If we change the pressure so it drops below or above atmospheric pressure, then the air is going to move from high to low, whichever way it's going to go, okay? It's always going to move from high to low. Now the only other thing that you'll sometimes see is another pressure that is called intra, right? That's within, pulmonary pressure, okay? Intrapulmonary pressure. This is the pressure that's within the pleural cavities, okay? Remember that like the heart, the lungs sit in their own cavities, and they have a slippery serous membrane on the outside of them, okay? Now, when we were just talking about how we ventilate the lungs, we said we contract the muscles, the cavity itself gets bigger, and then the lungs naturally expand. Well, there's one small step to that, okay? The lungs themselves are not directly attached to those muscles. It's not like the skeletal muscles that we learned before, where it's like, here's the muscle, here's the tendon, and it attaches to the bone, and when the muscle contracts, the bone follows it. Not like that, okay? The muscles are along the edges of the cavity. So they can change the space, the volume of the cavity, but the lungs don't have a direct connection inside. So why do the lungs follow the wall of the cavity? Okay? The lungs follow the wall of the cavity because of that intrapulmonary pressure. Okay? What it is that slippery membrane that's on the outside of the lungs. It's called the visceral pleura. And the slippery membrane that's on the outside, or that's lining the cavity, called the private pleura, they create a suction. If you've ever taken like 2 pieces of glass, so let's say this, right? So if you have a cold drink and it's on a coaster, like a glass coaster or a ceramic one, right? As the condensation on the outside of the glass is kind of trickling down, it creates water between the glass and the coaster. And then you're at your party and you pick up the glass, and all of a sudden, this coaster sticks onto it for a while, and then because of gravity, it drops off and makes a big noise and never looked at you, right? That time, when the water was holding the coaster to the glass, that was showing you this thing of what we call surface tension, right? That water tends to stick together, and it can basically adhere these two things together. Same thing happens in terms of the surface of the lung and the wall of the cavity. That little serous fluid from those membranes that are there, they create a suction. And so because of that suction, there's a negative pressure right there, a suction, that keeps the wall of the lung attached to the wall of the cavity. Okay? So that's the way that if we contract those muscles to move the wall of the cavity, the wall of the lung is stuck to it because that intrapulmonary pressure is always a suction, it's a negative, and it keeps it attached to it. Okay? So what does that mean? That means in order to understand ventilation for the lungs, you need to know those two muscles. Okay? When we contract those two muscles, increases the size of the cavity, decreases the pressure, air moves in. Okay? When we relax those muscles, we decrease the size of the cavity, pressure goes up, air moves out. Okay? That's the first thing you need to know. Second thing you need to know are those three pressures: atmospheric, intraalveolar, and intrapulmonary pressure. You need to be able to describe what those three pressures do in terms of allowing us to get air to go into and out of the lungs. Now, intrapulmonary pressure, that last one we just talked about, you can just say, make the wall of the lungs stick to the wall of the cavity so that the lungs move when the muscles contract. Okay? The other two, let me do a little bit more detail in terms of that, right? You got to talk about how, when you contract those muscles, the intraalveolar pressure gets lower. Once it's lower than atmospheric, the air will move from high to low, and you can inflate the lungs or whatever. Yeah, talk about those two different pressures. Okay? But that's what you need to know in terms of ventilation of the lungs. Two muscles involved, three pressures involved, and you know what they do. Okay? Okay. So let's look at other things that we have inside here. This thing here that has to do with different lung volumes and stuff like that. There's a respiratory physiology lab that you can look through for interstate. This is how they would measure how well your lungs are doing what they're supposed to do, like ECG and stuff like that for the heart. This is for the lungs. Not important for the exam. Okay? So don't worry about that for the exam. Okay. This part right here is a small amount of detail for how the respiratory system works. Okay? So he says that muscles are involved that allows us to ventilate the lungs. Well, how do we get muscles to do what they want to do? How do we stimulate muscles? What's that?
Contract.
Yeah, so muscles contract, but what gets them to contract? How do they know when to? Electrical impulses from neurons, right? So the brain tells the muscle when to contract. That's how the diaphragm is going to know when to contract, and the external intercostal muscles. Okay? So the point here is the brain controls that natural respiratory rate. It increases the rate when you're running, it decreases it when you're doing your yoga and when you're sleeping and stuff like that. Okay? So the main thing you need to know about this is, of course, that the brain is in control of the respiratory rate. Okay? And there are two parts of the brain that are involved. The medulla oblongata is the main part. It is the main part of the brain stem that is directly stimulating those muscles and telling them what to do. Okay? There's a second part of the brain stem called the pons that kind of oversees and coordinates what's going on with the medulla. Okay? But really, all you need to know is that it's the pons and the medulla oblongata that control respiratory rate and breathing and stuff like that. Okay? Is that a good thing? Good? Okay. So that means all these things that you see here, you don't got to worry about. Okay? So you just need...
They control all the breathing, just the pons and medulla oblongata.
Exactly. Okay? Alright, this part here, you don't have to know the details about it, but I do want to explain it just for a minute so that we can make sure, at least we have a conceptual understanding about what's going on here, right? It says factors that affect breathing. Well, if we're going to coordinate the activities of the lungs, we need to know, the brain needs to know when we need to increase and when we need to decrease the respiratory rate, right? So why might we need to have more oxygen? Well, under what circumstances might we need more oxygen?
Underwater.
Underwater, you might. In underwater, if you're like swimming, like if you're really actively, you're going to need to breathe more. What else? If you're running, like so we're saying, if the cells are more active, They need more energy. They need to make more ATP. That's going to require more oxygen. They're going to be taking out more carbon dioxide. Okay? Both of those things, oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, are going to be things that we're going to have receptors always monitoring. Do you have enough oxygen in the tissues? Do you have too much carbon dioxide? If those are getting out of whack, then we need to change the respiratory rate in order to bring in more oxygen and be able to get rid of that excess carbon dioxide that the cells are producing. Okay? So there's not a lot that we're going to go into about this, but let's just kind of bring full circle that if we're going to follow that negative feedback loop and homeostatic loop, it's going to be receptors that are looking for how the body's doing for these needs. They're going to feed it back to the brainstem, and the brainstem is going to respond down to the lungs appropriately and say, okay, we're not doing anything right now. Carbon dioxide levels are nice and low. We can slow our breathing rate, take shallow breaths and stuff like that instead.
That's kind of answered. So the receptors figure out whether or not you need more.
Yeah.
They tell the pons, diapers that has to do a lot of like carry out to it.
Exactly. So as a manager, it tells the respiratory muscles how much we need to breathe. And that can include the respiratory rate, how many breaths per minute. It can also include the depth of your breathing too, big breaths or shallow ones. Just like the heart, right? Number of beats per second, or the strength of those contractions is going to affect how much activity it does.
I have a question.
Yes.
About asthma.
Yes.
So for asthma, some people, it's harder for them to breathe in, like take their breath, and then like their lung can't expand as much.
Right.
And the other way, also, like they can't breathe out.
Yep. So that chart that we saw before with all the waves on it, that comes from the spirometer that would measure how much you're able to take in and put out. Okay. So with asthma, what you have is a disease, usually has to do with allergies and things like that. Okay. Where some of that bronchial tree that we saw before, some of the passageways that allow the air to go to and from the lungs, they have smooth muscle in them. And just like the arteries and veins, with muscle, you can constrict it or you can dilate it. And just like with the arteries and veins, if we constrict it and make those too smaller, it's harder for things to go through. And so when you're having an allergic response, your body's breathing something in, and if it's really allergic to it, like pollen or something like that, it says, oh, there's bad stuff coming in here. Let's close down these tubes so we're not getting as much of that bad stuff. Well, the consequence is you're not getting as much air either, because it's harder to make that volume go through that smaller tube. So when they are taking their medicines, like hormones and stuff like that, they're taking chemical messengers that they take in, and it tells that smooth muscle to dilate and open up again. And then it's easier for the air to go in and out. Yeah.
Is that how you can train your lungs to hold the air you need to stand in water longer? Is that in the same?
It's a balance of things. So you can, like any other muscles, you can certainly train some of those muscles to work a little bit better in terms of diaphragm and external intercostals. So you might be able to take in more air than others. The other thing is that is supplying the oxygen, but another way to kind of extend it out is if you can train your body to use less oxygen and kind of go into like a lower metabolic state and not be panicked and stuff like that, then you're going to use less oxygen until the amount of air that you took in is going to last you longer.
But are you changing the bronchial tree at all? Is it changing at all? Is it dilating more, or is it?
No, because usually when you're talking about holding your breath and stuff like that, the first step is getting air into and out of it, like we talked about. And so unless you're having some sort of allergic reaction, most of these tubes are all the way open. There's no reason to constrict them. But then it's kind of like how well you can use that tank of oxygen you took in really affects more in terms of how long you can hold your breath, et cetera. Yes.
Sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
For certain people, is it harder or easier for like breathe in cold air or hot air or warmer air?
Usually, it's harder for people to breathe in cold air because when we go along these respiratory pathways, down here, they're pretty delicate structures, just like the capillary, very thin, very delicate. We want to make sure the air is all prepped for when it arrives down there. And so if you're breathing extremely dry air out there or cold air or something like that, it hasn't had time to really prep very well. And so the whole idea of the mucous membranes and stuff like that and all these different passages is it gives the air time to get warm and get moist before it gets down to the respiratory pathways where it's going to be exchanged. So anything that's a little bit different, if it's colder, if it's drier, it's going to be harder to breathe in easily. Yeah. Okay. So our next major topic then is exchange, right? So we just talked about ventilation, we know how that works. Now, how do we get these gases to exchange, to move across the alveolar wall, across into the blood, etc.? So this is showing us one big alveolus right here. Okay? Here's the capillary that's right next to it. In terms of the gases exchanging, we want oxygen to go into the capillary, and we want carbon dioxide to go out of the capillary and go into the alveolus. Okay? Now notice this thing that's called the respiratory membrane here, it's pretty thin, right? This is one single flattened cell layer right there, right? That's epithelial, single squamous epithelium, and so is that. Okay? So this is about the thinnest membrane that you can get in the body right there, is that respiratory membrane. Because both the alveolus and the capillary is made up of, their wall is made up of one single flattened cell layer. That's it. It's like wafer thin. Okay? So that makes it easier for these gases to exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, in terms of why those gases were removed, how come oxygen is going to go into the capillary and carbon dioxide is going to go the opposite way? That's very nice. That's exactly what we wanted to do, but why? How come carbon dioxide doesn't stay where it is, or how come it doesn't go along the same way as oxygen? Okay? It's, to a certain extent, the same thing that we just talked about in terms of pressure with the lungs. We have high pressure in one area, low pressure in another area, move from high to low. And we liken that to diffusion, where we have high concentration in one area, low concentration in another area, moves from high to low. That's how oxygen and carbon dioxide moves as well. Now, the air that you breathe is not 100% oxygen. In fact, it's not even mostly oxygen. The air that we have is a mixture of gases. Okay? Most of it is nitrogen gas. 79% of the air that you have out there is nitrogen gas, which you do not use. Okay? Approximately 21% of it is actually oxygen, and then the remaining like 1% or less than 1% is carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, stuff like that. Okay? When you inhale a fresh load of air into your lungs, that has the highest concentration of oxygen because it's fresh. You just got it from out here. The trees made it, the plants made it, and stuff like that. Okay? That's a high oxygen content right there in the alveolus. Now think about it. The blood is coming up here to that capillary, returned to the right side of the heart, the blue side of the heart, and was pushed to the lungs via that pulmonary artery, pulmonary trunk, right? It's deoxygenated blue blood. That means it has low oxygen concentration, right? Because we already gave all that oxygen to the tissue. So the blood that's here in the capillary, low oxygen, the oxygen content of the alveolus, high oxygen. So we've got a gradient there. So the oxygen will naturally diffuse from the alveolus where it's high into the capillaries where it's low. Okay? So it just naturally moves via diffusion. Carbon dioxide is actually the opposite. Think about it. We get in a big, fresh load of air. It's got a low concentration of carbon dioxide in it. The plants that are out there use carbon dioxide. They take it from the atmosphere. So this is low carbon dioxide over here. Think about that blue blood that's arriving at the lungs again. It's gone all the way through the circuit. We've dropped off oxygen. We've picked up carbon dioxide. So that blue blood that's coming towards the lung has a relatively high concentration of carbon dioxide in it. So we see high carbon dioxide in the blood here. In that fresh load of air, we have low carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide moves the other way. It goes from high here in the blood to low there in the lung. And we get rid of carbon dioxide from the blood. Straight diffusion. We don't have to push it, no spending ATP or anything like that. It diffuses from high to low. Okay? So we said that it's the concentration of each of those gases that causes them to move from high to low. And luckily, they move just how they're supposed to move. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out. Now, the only hitch to that, it's not really a hitch, but we've been using concentration. We said high concentration of oxygen here, low concentration in here. Okay? Technically, the term is partial pressure. So let's look at that. Partial pressure. Partial looks like part, one part. Okay? We said that with the air, it's made up of a lot of different parts. Nitrogen gas, carbon dioxide gas, oxygen gas, carbon monoxide gas. It's a bunch of different parts that make the whole. Okay? The oxygen only cares about what its concentration is here compared to in here. So, if you substitute concentration with what we've been saying so far, with that term partial pressure, then it's basically the same thing. That's the correct term to use. Partial pressure is what that particular gas contributes to the total pressure. Okay? So, out here, we have a high concentration or partial pressure of oxygen. In the blood that's coming up there, we have a low concentration or partial pressure of oxygen. So when you're talking about gas exchange, and this is the same as how it works in the lungs, is down in the tissues. It's all about the concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Where is it high and where is it low? It's going to move from high to low. Okay? Yeah.
So on the test, it's going to use partial pressure instead of high pressure, low pressure.
You should say partial pressure.
Okay.
So you can say, lump it all together. High partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus, low partial pressure of oxygen in the capillary causes it to move from the lung, from the alveolus into the blood. Okay? Okay. So the good thing about that, right, is that that type of exchange that we were just talking about here is the same thing that occurs in the lungs when we call external respiration. We're exchanging with the external environment. The same mechanism is involved in internal respiration. When you get down to the tissues, okay, the blood has gone through the arteries and the arterioles and the capillaries, and it arrives at the tissues. It has a lot of oxygen. Just picked it up in the lungs up there. It's got a lot of oxygen waiting for delivery. So that's a high concentration or high partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. When you look at the tissues, okay, the tissues over here, they're working hard. They're using the oxygen. So they, especially if they're active, have a low concentration or partial pressure of oxygen. So here's where oxygen is high in the blood. And the tissues there, that's where it's low. We're going to move the oxygen from high here to low there, and the cells get the oxygen they need. On the flip side, if this cell is working really hard, he's producing a lot of carbon dioxide. That means this is going to be high carbon dioxide here. This fresh arterial blood doesn't have a lot of carbon dioxide. It's going to be low here. So we're going to draw, the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the tissues into the blood, and now we've got that carbon dioxide that we're going to take back to the lungs to exchange like we just said there. So the same thing works down for the internal respiration or the internal gas exchange. It's all about partial pressure or concentration of those two gases. Okay? Yes?
Figuring out the word it. I'm trying to figure out, so if you're, let's say you exercise every day, but you only exercise, your upper muscles. So you're not getting as much rest
Lower body pressure.
if it's completely like
Resting. Yeah.
if you're
Like if you're in a wheelchair.
exactly. So just that lack of, I mean, obviously your muscles are going to get bigger, whatever. I'm not really looking at muscles so much, specifically respiration. Is that, I mean, does that have any kind of impact other than on the muscles themselves, like in those areas of the body that the lack of respiration down here and the high quantities of it up here make a difference or anything?
Not really. I mean, the cellular need, the tissue need, is what drives this. And so, if there's more indicators that the tissues are really active, then the cardiovascular system can respond by delivering more of what they need. Okay? If you guys over here are not very active, then as I go by, I don't get any indication that you need a lot of oxygen. I'll only give you a little bit. I'll pick up whatever you have. Once I get to you guys over here, if you're working hard, then there's going to be different chemical kind of stimulations that tell me that. The concentration of oxygen is going to be really low there. Carbon dioxide is going to be really high there because you're working. It's probably going to be warmer there, like muscles contracting, and that'll be a stimulation. And then pH and other things. So that tells the blood, this is an area where we need to drop off a lot of oxygen, a lot more. And so it'll give the tissue whatever it needs. So it's more determined by what the tissue is doing as opposed to the blood determining what the tissues can do.
Right, so just for the respiratory system, it almost doesn't matter. Obviously matters for like circulation, for muscle tone, or whatever, you don't want to stop it. But,
right.
I mean, as far as respiratory system is concerned, it doesn't care where it goes.
No.
It's not like it's getting less use.
No, the brain assesses all that. So the brain goes around and kind of assesses, okay, from all these chemoreceptors all over, I'm noticing we're having a lot of activity here, not as much there. Okay, so my overall oxygen need is about this. So I need to tell them I need this much oxygen per unit time. And then I'll decide where I need to dilate blood vessels and make sure it gets here, constrict blood vessels and not route it over there and stuff like that. Okay, so what we've covered then so far is 3 out of the 4 main things. We've done ventilation, and we've done both internal and external respiration, that gas exchange. So that means there's only one major topic left in terms of the respiratory system, and that's how these things are transported. And luckily, we already hit that in blood, okay? But we'll review it here. So gas transport, like we said, most of the oxygen is transported down to the hemoglobin molecule, okay? So you gotta know that. And if you don't have enough oxygen, this isn't critical for the exam, but if you don't have enough oxygen, that enters you into a condition that's called hypoxia. Hypo, like low, right? Oxygen, like oxygen. So if you're hypoxic, then your tissues are not getting the oxygen that they need. There's a demand there, but for whatever reason, you're not supplying that demand. So you're going to have some bad effects of that down the way. Okay? Okay. So oxygen is pretty straightforward. It's bound to the hemoglobin molecule. We can see it right here. Okay? Now, when that hemoglobin molecule arrives down in the cell, it's going to need to get it up. We said that it has to do with partial pressure of it, right? This P that you see here, PO2, that's partial pressure of oxygen. That's what the P stands for. Okay? Look at the number. It's 95 here in the blood. In the cells, it's 40. That's a good gradient, right? So we have a high here, we have a low there. It's going to diffuse into the cells. Okay? Okay, so oxygen is transported attached to the hemoglobin molecules, and then when we get down there, the hemoglobin molecules will give it up to the cells, and they'll diffuse into the tissues. Yeah?
Just so I have straight, the hemoglobin molecule, is that attached to red blood cells or within the red blood cells? I mean, I guess it doesn't matter, but
it's mostly within the plasma membrane of the red blood cell. Okay. So all along that sort of embedded in the plasma membrane.
And that's what carries the oxygen?
What's that?
That's what carries the oxygen?
That's what carries the oxygen. It's what makes the red blood and the red blood cells red. It binds to that iron molecule that's inside of the hemoglobin. Remember? Like your metal that's outside in your yard, and when it gets oxidized, it turns a reddish color. It rusts, right? So that's what makes the blood red. Yeah?
Where did they carry it to?
So,
everywhere, just like
everywhere.
underneath.
Yeah.
So if we were explaining it, we would just say that hemoglobin which carries the oxygen to the rest of the body.
You say that tissues that need it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Now, in terms of carbon dioxide transport, the main way that carbon dioxide is transported is as bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate molecule, the HCO3, is floating around in the plasma. Okay? So the way that it does that is that we start out with some water that's in the plasma. We combine that with the carbon dioxide, and what that gives us is something that's called carbonic acid, like this. That quickly falls apart into one free hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. Okay? So you can see that CO2 here is encased, if you will, or part of that bicarbonate ion there. So that's the main way that CO2 is transported in the blood. It's in the plasma, and it's in the form of bicarbonate ion, that HCO3 like that. Okay? Now there is some carbon dioxide that will actually bind to hemoglobin. So that's what you see up here. But most of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate. So you got to remember that. So here we see the same thing. Okay? Now the reason, here's the red blood cell. Remember it's a biconcave disc. It dents in on either side. Okay? Here is the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is going to be produced in the cell. It's going to diffuse into the bloodstream, right? Let's look at the concentrations or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. 45 out here in the tissues, 40 here in the blood. Now it's not as steep of a gradient, but we still, it's high here and it's low there. So it's going to diffuse into the blood.
Do we need to know how much?
No, you don't need to know actual numbers. Just know where it's high and where it's going to be low.
That's the bicarbonate.
So this is for carbon dioxide, but the carbon dioxide in the next step is going to turn into bicarbonate to be carried in the blood.
So it's higher in the tissue than lower in the blood?
Right. Because the tissues are actually making carbon dioxide as a byproduct through their different chemical reactions.
And is it the other way around for the...
Alveolar line. What?
For the oxygen or the...
Oh yeah, for the oxygen. The oxygen is going to be relatively high in the blood vessels.
Yeah, okay.
And it's going to be low in the tissues. Yeah. So here's that chemical reaction right here. That whole conversion of carbon dioxide into bicarbonate ion, like you see there, actually occurs in the red blood cell. So they don't actually carry the carbon dioxide, but they do the chemical reaction that changes it from carbon dioxide into bicarbonate. And that's what we see down here. And the bicarbonate floats along and gets transported up to the lungs, and then the reverse happens. We change from bicarbonate back into carbon dioxide, and then you exhale it out, and there you go. Okay?
Or does it change back to anything?
The same reaction that you see there in the red blood cells at the tissues, once it actually gets up to the pulmonary capillaries, the reverse happens. Same chemical equation, but it just goes back the other way instead. It's one of those very important what we call reversible chemical reactions. If we need it to go one way, like if we need to get a lot of carbon dioxide, and we need to change it to bicarbonate, we can do that. But when we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide, we can make it go the other way. We take the bicarbonate, put it together with the hydrogen ion, and make water and carbon dioxide that we can exhale. Okay?
Is that why we exhale?
Most of the water actually stays in the plasma, but it certainly contributes to the overall fluids in your body. Okay? That's it. That's respiratory system. Look, I ain't got extra time. When you sneeze, you have your 100 mile an hour sneeze. So that's the irritation of mucous membranes and stuff like that. And so it's a very, very quick type of expulsion. Now when you're doing exhalations, we were talking about just kind of resting exhalation like you're doing right now, inhalation, exhalation. We didn't get into the details of it, but you can, like if you're blowing up a balloon, you actually recruit other muscles so you can forcibly exhale. So if you can feel it in your abs, right, you recruit those, and it pushes on your abdominal organs, that pushes on the diaphragm, and it shrinks this even faster, and so it makes the air come out faster. So, yeah, same thing with cough, if you're kind of doing yeah, allergens or just irritants, where it's kind of giving you a tickling sensation or whatever. Yeah.
Do you need to be able to describe the structure of the vocal cord?
Do what?
Describe the structure of the vocal cords and
Nope.
the pitch and everything like that?
Not for the exam. We're streamlined. What we looked at today in that's what you need to know for the lecture exam.
Okay. I was just making sure because it was on the study.
On the objectives, right?
Yeah.
But we kind of got condensed in our timeline, so we tried to make it a little bit easier. Timeline for the test is typical type of thing. So you'll have the full period to do the test. It'll be mostly multiple choice questions and things like that. Thursday? Yeah. Thursday. Thursday. Yeah. Go over the immune system notes.
And you said you...
Yeah. It's in the archive. Yeah. So if you look at that, you can see it.
There right now.
We can do a little bit right now too. All right, so if you guys have any questions between now and then, definitely ask. There is a quiz available too, a lecture quiz. So remember, with the lecture quizzes, go through it first yourself, see what you can do on your own before you submit it. Go through and double check those answers in the lecture notes or wherever you want, so you get a nice high score. But use it as a quiz so you can see how you're doing, see where you need to spend more time. And I think the lecture quiz is over immune system and respiratory system together. Okay, so that should be available. All right? All right, got any questions? Let me know. Yes? We'll need that too, huh?
10 and 11.
10 and 11, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
I got to see that.
Yeah, sure.
Email you about the
And what did I say?
She thinks that you said 12:30 in your office.
Yeah.
Everything to work.
Yeah, 12:30, 1:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'm always there. So you don't even need an appointment. Usually I'll be there a little bit beforehand too.
Okay, that's just over around the corner.
Yep, on the other side.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
So let's see here.
yeah.
I don't really need to worry about this as much. We need to know that the fluid inside them is constant. With all this type of thing here, you would say the main thing you need to know about is that they have the same 3 layers as we saw in blood vessels, and their overall structure is most similar to veins because there's no heart that's pushing it along the way here. You can see they start here at the capillaries, we're going to go all the way back to the heart. So it's very low pressure, slow moving, so they got the little valves along the way here and stuff like that. The other thing is in terms of drainage of all this excess fluid that they're picking up, there's 2 main drains that dump it back into the cardiovascular system. The thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Right lymphatic duct handles the upper right part of the body, like this. Thoracic duct handles everything else, all the lower parts of the body, the upper left-hand side, and then the left-hand side of the head. So they drain here and here, and it's kind of a subclavian thing. This isn't particularly critical. Like we said, the fluids that they pick up when it's left behind the tissue is called lymph. One of the things that we said is that in those pathways, when we're picking up that fluid, it's kind of like your fluid filtration system, and that with a fluid filtration system, you're going to take some of the fluid out, but before you put it back into circulation, you're going to filter it. Lymph nodes are like the filters. And so at distinct points along the way, we're going to run it through these filters using different types of macrophages, right? There's big eating cells in there that are going to get rid of bacteria or anything that we picked up along the way, get rid of it, and then we have clear, or basically clean lymph that's coming out of it. For this one, if you could come up with just like a 1-sentence description about what the thymus and the spleen do, that would be fine. And then when we get to this section, the main thing you want to understand is that, and there's a video, that's another thing, is you want to take a look at the archive too, because there's a website that we looked at that has kind of a video animation summary of the lymphatic system. It kind of goes through it. But basically, we divide our defenses into first line, second line, and third line of defense. Okay? So the first line of defense is called the external innate defenses. Okay? This is sometimes called non-specific. And so with this, what we're doing is we're trying to keep these infectious agents, right? And a disease-causing agent is called a pathogen. You definitely know what a pathogen is. It's going to be like bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, stuff like that. Things that want to get inside you and then cause disease and replicate, stuff like that. Okay? So these pathogens are trying to get inside. It's like a war. And so we've got 3 lines of defense against it. The first line of defense is just flat out keeping them out. Okay? So we've got things like skin and mucous membranes, even being the wrong species for a disease to try to take care of you. All these things are first lines of defense. Even chemical barriers, gastric juice like hydrochloric acid, lysozymes, they all will kill things off the surface so they don't get inside. So that's first line of defense. And when we say non-specific here, the part about non-specific is your defenses need to be able to tell what is part of you and what is foreign. Okay? And on those cells, like when we were talking about blood, on like a bacterial cell or something like that, there are all these little markers on the surface of the cell that are called antigens. Okay? And so the antigens are what your defensive cells are going up to these bacteria or whatever in our own cells, and they're looking at them and like, okay, you're on our team, okay, you're okay. Are you on our team? You okay? You on our team? No, I don't recognize you as part of us. I'm going to try to kill you. And when we say non-specific, it's just that simple sorting. Is it self or is it foreign? If it's self, it's going to protect it. If it's foreign, it's going to attack it. Okay? Second and third line of defenses are both internal. So that means something got past the external defenses, and now we have to battle up inside. Okay? Second line of defense is also non-specific. Okay. When we say innate, that means that you're born with it, and non-specific means that it doesn't care what it is. If it's not you, it's going to try to kill it. Okay. So internal non-specific, we've got different examples of that we can see here. So interferon, those are going to be internal defenses. Fever is going to be an internal defense, where you're trying to heat it up and make it hostile. Inflammation is going to be second line. Phagocytosis, where we have these big eating cells like this that are going around and eating bacteria, etc. Okay? These are all second lines of defense. Things got inside. These don't care what it is, but it's not you, so they're going to try to get rid of it. Okay? Third line of defense is here. Okay? So third line of defense is internal, and now we call it specific. The reason that we call it specific is that not only do we care about whether it's you or not you, but we care exactly about what it is. It really matters, number one, if it's a virus or a bacterium, but it also matters, is it a cold virus, is it a flu virus, is it a chickenpox virus, or what it is, because these defenses will be able to deal with that particular pathogen. And it will be very effective at getting rid of that pathogen, and then it remembers that you've been infected with that before, and if you get infected with that same exact pathogen again, it knows how to deal with it, so it has a memory to it. Okay? Now, our examples for third line of defense are going to be in here. So these are talking about antigens, okay? And then we're talking about here are going to be T cells and B cells. They're both lymphocytes, but we sometimes call them B cells, T cells. Okay? So you then need to know how the B cells and the T cells protect you. So the T cells here will identify a foreign antigen-bearing cell, like bacteria, and they give us what's called cell-mediated immunity. Meaning that they come up to the bacteria, they identify it, and then they secrete chemicals on it that kill it off. Okay? So in the video, in the animation, they talk about these like infantry, right? So they have to go up and they have to do hand-to-hand combat in order to kill it off. Okay? These cells are going to do something different. Okay? So these cells here, their main role is to actually produce antibodies. Okay? When they become activated, we call them plasma cells, and that's what you see here. Here's some B cells. One of them is becoming activated by a particular antigen. It kind of goes into an incredible Hulk type of form, which we call plasma cells, and it starts pumping out these antibodies that we see here, just like the blood antibodies. Those antibodies will stick to the pathogen, and it will help to get rid of it. Like when we stick to it, it'll like for the blood cells, it will like like molecular handcuffs. It'll grab a bunch of them and hold them all in one place, or our phagocytes can come and eat a bunch of them. It acts like a little flag in the surface of it, so that the phagocyte can help grab onto it and eat it and stuff like that. But that's how the B cells, the specific part of the immune system dealing with B cells, that's how they produce antibodies, and the antibodies then stick to our pathogens and help to get rid of them.
Okay, so they don't actually kill them, they pull them, so.
Yeah. So the B cells themselves, the B cells don't go to the pathogen and do that hand-to-hand combat. They're more like, and again, it's kind of in the animation, they're like an archer, right? The archer's way protected and stuff like that, and it just shoots the arrows like the antibodies, and the antibodies actually stick to the pathogen and help to kill it off. Okay? So the main thing with the immune system is, I mean, we started out a little bit in terms of lymphatics and the collection of the excess fluid and stuff like that, but the bulk of the information with the immune system has to do with your defenses and dividing them into 3 lines of defense, knowing kind of the title of them, and then being able to give examples of each one and kind of what those examples do.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Random question. What does it mean, or when people say, oh, he has a weak immune system? You mean they're weak on these 13?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if that many people know exactly what that translates to. Okay. It means that, in essence, when these defenses come into play, they should be able to overwhelm, right, the war. So the bacteria get in there and they reproduce and stuff like that. Our cells go into it, they reproduce, and they usually win the war, right? We don't usually die from a bacterial infection or whatever.
Right.
But some people, just like some people can run faster than others or be stronger than others, their bodies are not exactly the same in terms of how well to defend them. And so maybe when they get sick, they're sick for like 2 weeks, and it takes a lot of fever and a lot of swollen lymph nodes and all that stuff for them to get through it. Other people, it's like, oh, I feel a little bit of a fever coming on, but next day I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And so for whatever reason, the second person's immune system, maybe they identify it faster, maybe they're, the thing about the T and the B cells and stuff like that in these defensive cells, they're like an army. The more you have, the stronger you are. And so it could be that people with a weak immune system, they don't make these cells as fast, and so the bacterial cells are reproducing, these numbers going up, and these are trying to play catch up. Meanwhile, somebody with a strong immune system get a lot of these T and B cells and really attack them and get rid of it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure, no worries.